Right, good, we're live. Hi everyone, welcome to the first Facebook Live expert panel session of 2023. For those of you who have seen them before, we did a few of these last year about how you can get the most energy efficiency out of heating systems. We were joined by a few guest speakers. Richard and Kim were my steadfast loyals throughout, and they're here with me tonight. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. For those of you who haven't been on before, but yeah, so tonight we're going to talk about pumps. Last year there was quite a lot of chat in all of the sessions about pumps and variable speeds and fixed speeds and all of this stuff that I don't really know much about, and so I thought we'd do a bit of a deep dive tonight with Richard and Kim, who can introduce themselves now.
Go for it, Rich.
Go for it. All right, I'm Richard Burrows. I've grown a beard this year, so that's the biggest difference between me this year and last year. So yeah, I run 𝗵𝗲𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 Drayton last year. And yeah, just more of the same this year. So more info, more us. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, more of the same. I'm the same. More of the same. So I'm Kimbo from the 𝗵𝗲𝗁𝗵𝗁 Academy. I am the 𝗵𝗲𝗁𝗵𝗁 Academy. It's just me in my bedroom. I do get out and about around the UK from time to time, but I'm just trying to spread the word. Simple explanations for relatively simple issues. Doesn't need a tremendous amount to understand how you move water around and get the right amount, the right place at the right time. If you understand a few basic principles, so that's what I'm all about. And the pump, of course, what we're talking about tonight, probably the most important part of all of that. Anyway, back to you, Claire.
Yeah, no, so carry on actually. Kim, why is the pump the most important part of that? I'll let you guys kind of give it a bit of an intro and why it's so important.
Well, I remember a couple of years ago, I did a thing on their training, and they were trying to relate various parts of the heating system to relate to various parts of the body. And the heart, obviously, is the pump, most important thing of all. If we've got a problem with the pump or problem with the heart, then nothing else is going to function properly. And that's apt in any scenario. It's like having an engine that's over revving or under revving. If we haven't got it on its sweet spot, if it's not doing what we want it to do when we want it to do it, then everything else is going to be suffering. And what we find is that there seems to be a sort of a generic rumor now with EHP pumps. EPH, gosh, let's get it right. No, where was I? Yeah, that's right. That they're all like automatic, and that they sort of come out the box and they have a little look around on their own and they suss out what sort of system they're on, and they set themselves up and say, yeah, I'm that clever, I can do all this on my own, and now I'm going to pump the right amount of stuff at the right place, maybe even at the right temperature if we get everything right. And of course that isn't the case at all. The pump, be it in a boiler or be it in a box of its own, has absolutely no idea what system it's going on, and so we need to tell it. And it's understanding what the system or what type of system that we've got will determine how we need to set the pump up. We need to look at things called the index circuit. You can do a couple of minutes on the index circuit, Rich, can't you? We'll talk about that in a moment. But understanding how to adjust it is one thing, but knowing why and what to adjust it to is just as important. So we need to understand that part of it as well, and that's this thing called the index circuit. So before we can really start to understand pumps, we actually need to understand what the pump needs to do. And like I say, I'll give Rich 30 seconds on the index circuit while I slurp my tea. Yeah.
Thanks, mate. So yeah, so what Kim said is, first of all, we need to know actually what we're trying to do. So what type of heat generator have we got to start with? Because obviously our heat generator is the key thing, because obviously if we're running a boiler system at DT20, we don't need hardly as much flow as we require for the same if we had a heat pump running at DT5. So even if it was 7 kilowatts, so say it was 7 kilowatt boiler, 7 kilowatt heat pump, very unlikely because all boilers are oversized, as you well know. But if it was the same, then our heat pump would actually be running at 4 times the flow rate of the gas boiler at DT20. So you've got to have that knowledge to know actually how much volume of water we need to pump around that system in the first place. So we got to know that, but then we've also got to know is what is our furthest. So what circuit in our heating system is the furthest with the greatest quantity of fluid that needs to flow down that pipework. So because if we don't know that, we don't actually know where we actually need to set our pump to, because like Kin-Bo said, these things do not work themselves out. Okay, they can give you what you set them to, but ultimately they won't necessarily give you the right flow at the right head pressure. Okay, so let's take a 𝗵𝗲𝗁𝗃 pump, for instance. If we were to set that to speed 1, and actually if we guess at it, so we set it to speed 1, we go, okay, well that's not quite getting the amount of flow down to that radiator ends. What I'll do is I'll guess speed 2. So we put it to speed 2, we try it, and actually we're still not getting enough flow to that index circuit. Do you know what I mean? Because it's quite a distance, nothing else is balanced, it's all whizzing round all the stuff you haven't bothered balancing in the first place. And then we got that end circuit, so we got the speed 3, and we're just about getting some heat there now, and we're getting around it, but all the others now are cooking hot. You know, if you did your DT clamps around your radiators that are closest, we're actually find that we got really narrow DTs on all the closest stuff, and your furthest radiator is basically, it's got a really wide DT. So if we were to clamp it and we were looking at it, if we say, for instance, we wanted DT 20 across that, maybe we'd be getting DT 30 across it, because like I said, we've got really narrow DTs across your radiators you've not balanced, and then you got actually a really wide DT across your furthest radiator. It might not be your furthest radiator, it might be the radiator with the biggest capacity, but that's basically your index circuit. So the radiator that hasn't got the correct DT across it at your correct speed, then that's probably your index rad. So what you end up then having to do is balance all your radiators correctly. And what we mean by balancing is not necessarily temperature balancing, it's getting the flow rate correct around your closest radiators. Once we've achieved that, then actually what you can do is you can start actually strangling your pump back a bit, because we don't need it run at speed 3. There's hardly any installations out there that you would ever need a 6 or a 7 meter head pump at speed 3. You're probably going to be on speed 1 or 2, but you'll only achieve that if you can get all your radiators that are closest correctly flow rate balanced first. So, and that like I said, that is variable. That varies on the installation, that varies on the heat generator. There's so many little factors in that one pump, one speed won't fix all. It's something you've got to calculate. It's something you've got to work out. And like I said, lots of people out there just don't bother calculating, stick it on speed 3, and actually, you know, increasing your flow rate around your system actually increases resistance. So you can actually cause yourself your own headache and your own worst enemy, actually, because as that's whizzing around the heating circuit, actually it's probably causing actually more friction, more resistance, and more issues than actually if it was on speed 1 and it was all correctly set up. So there's so many things around pumps, but one of the key things, one of the absolute key things for me is the amount of energy use. Now I can't remember what the statistics was, Kim, but it's something like 1/3 of the whole world's energy usage is actually used in pumps and oversized pumps and pumps on speed 3. So when you start actually thinking about that, and you start thinking, well, you know, okay, we've got ERP pumps now, but they still use a considerable amount of energy on speed 3 than they do actually speed 1. So what we need to actually do is actually start putting a bit of calculation behind what we're trying to do, work out actually the flow rates we need, relate that to our system pressure and our amount of head we require to overcome the system resistance, and then actually set our pump correctly. Because like I said, we can't guess at this. If we guess, we're just going to end up using more energy than actually if we calculate it all out right and balance everything else right. I think I went for more than 5 minutes then, mate. But
I think you got 30 seconds actually, Rich. I'm thinking.
Yeah, was it 30 seconds? I went over the 30. I got to work on that.
So, where do they find this calculation, or are you going to tell us that, Kin-Bo?
Well, before we get into any maths at the moment, just something else that I try and highlight. So let's look at the room that we're all sat in now. Okay, so wherever we may be watching this, and let's say that at -4 outside, that room that you're in needs 1 kilowatt of energy to keep it at 21 degrees, and that's a relatively simple mathematical formula, or we can use heat engineer software to work that out. So if we know how much energy we need at -4, we know what energy we need at -3, we know what energy we need at -2, we know what energy we need at -1, so on and so forth, all the way up to about 20 degrees. So we can work out for any outside temperature what the inside temperature needs to be. So if we know the amount of energy that we need to put into that room, and we do because we can work it out, we can work out exactly how much energy we need. If we supply that room with the correct amount of energy, and this is where balancing starts to come in, as opposed, like Richard said, it's not about getting your rads hot. What are we balancing to what? Well, first of all, we're trying to get the energy coming out of the boiler balanced with the energy that the system needs in its worst scenario. So if we use Richard's scenario of 7 kilowatts at -4, at -4, our pump only needs to give us the flow rate for 7 kilowatts. If it gives us 10 kilowatts, we've got too much and we're going to waste it. So that's where we start to balance it. So we start to adjust the pump pressure to the index circuit, as Richard was saying. And then we've got the maximum flow that property is ever going to need at -4. What we need to do then, balance-wise, is to look at each radiator individually, or each room, and say, right, I've done a heat loss on all of these rooms. This room I'm in at the moment needs 1 kilowatt at -4. The one next door needs 0.5 kilowatt. The one down the hall, the bedroom, needs 1/3 of a kilowatt. The living room needs 1.1 kilowatt, so on and so forth. Now, if we can divide that 7 kilowatt that's coming out the boiler into the, let's say, 10 rooms that we've got, and we put the right amount of energy into each one. Now, here's a thought. Why do we need TRVs and room stats? If we're supplying it with the right amount of energy, why do we need a TRV? We need a TRV because we're lazy. We need a TRV because we don't work anything out. We put 1,000 gallons a second down the pipe. We leave everything on maximum. The room overheats. There's way too much flow rate. There's way too much energy going into the room. And we rely on an old, sometimes they're 30 years old, we rely on an old TRV to try and control the room temperature rather than controlling the flow rate. And of course, these TRVs are old, they're quite inaccurate, they take forever to react. And basically, we're wasting energy all the time. And I'm sure we've all been there 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night when you're thinking, oh, blimey, it's a bit bloody warm in here. And it's because slowly but surely everything's cooking, there's too much energy around, everything's warming up. And like I say, we're wasting energy. So it's always something to fall back on that, to say, well, if you know, I remember the first job, or the first time I ever went into, it was a church hall, and I went in and I said to the devil, had a problem with the heating. I said, oh, where's the room stat? And he said, I don't know, mate. That was a vicar or whatever. He hadn't any idea. I said, well, how'd you do the temperature? And he said, I don't know, mate. It's just always at the right temperature. And I'm thinking, come on. There's going to be a room, and I remember wasting like half a day thinking, well, I wonder it don't work. We ain't got a bloody room stat. And needless to say, it was a 𝗵𝗲𝗻. So I made a few inquiries. I spoke to 𝗵𝗲𝗻 technical, and said, well, bloody how's that work? I tried to explain weather compensation, all that sort of thing. That was the first time I'd ever come across it. And that got me thinking into how important it is to get flow rates and everything correct. If we get it correct, you know, everything's going to work tickety-boo. I don't know if I've missed anything there, Richard.
Yeah, I was just going to say about because Rob wanted us to carry on a bit about the index circuit. Yeah. Okay, so the way I always explain setting up a pump for an index circuit. Okay, so your index circuit is like I said, the one that either requires the greatest amount of flow over a distance, or it's the furthest radiator. So two things, obviously, it's because what we're trying to overcome with a pump is actually the system resistance to flow. So it's either a radiator you've got a lot of flow to, which is normally the furthest one, or it's the absolute furthest radiator of significant capacity. So, but how do we set this up? How do we know when it's right? Okay, so there's a couple of ways. So like Drayton do the auto balancing TRV. Okay, so we can stick that on. We can be a little bit lazier than what we would normally be with a pump and setting all that up. But there's two ways we can do it. So if we just think about that, so that's like the quick and I would say lazy way of setting up a system. Okay, because we do need a bit of a pump pressure behind it to get those auto balancing TRVs to work. So that could actually mean we're going to use a little bit more energy. It'll be bloody 1,000,000 times more accurate than you'll ever get it by manually tweaking. But if we think about the index circuit and what we're trying to do, we're actually trying to set it up So you've got the right amount of flow going to that furthest or index circuit radiator at all times. So if we set our pump to speed 1, and when we clamp that furthest radiator, okay, once you've got all the other ones sort of balanced a bit, yeah, what we're trying to achieve is actually DT20. If you're a gas boiler, DT20 across that rad, okay. So if anyone's ever set up a solar thermal system, because solar thermal systems are brilliant for setting up index radiators on a typical heating system. So what you have on a solar thermal system is a pump station, and it's actually got a flow gauge in it. And wouldn't it be great if we had flow gauges on heating systems? Yeah, so we actually know what the hell we're doing. Yeah, but it's got a flow rate gauge on it. Okay, and as you turn the speed of the pump down, what you notice is the flow rate gauge keeps dropping down until you're sort of about there, aren't you? You've nearly got the right flow rate. Obviously, like I said, you've got to calculate this. Otherwise, what's flow rate? What do we actually need? Yeah. So once you've calculated it and you know the amount of flow that's meant to be going down to that radiator, if you then got the room temperature about right to your design calculation, so say you've designed it for DT20 across the radiator, 70-50, or now, 55-35, yeah, if we've got that temperature drop across the radiator, and say the room's been designed to like 20 degrees or 21 degrees, you would need 20 degrees in that room with, say you've designed it with 55-35, right? You would need 55 in, 35 out, and that room would need to be about 20 degrees Celsius. If you've got all those by balancing the pump down to speed 1, you've achieved what you're trying to achieve. If though the DT was narrower than that, so if say it's meant to be 20 and it's 15, what we actually need to do then is actually, if you're on speed 1, we need to start restricting the lock shield valve, or we actually need to start balancing that radiator down because you've got too much flow going through that index circuit. Okay, so once we've got that one sort of right, you kind of know all the others then from there actually need them restricting down further. You've got to restrict them down because the flow through those radiators, you're going to have really narrow DTs. And the sort of criminal thing out there at the moment, unfortunately, is some manufacturers' boilers. Are we allowed to name names?
Yeah, I will.
Kim will. So we've got some manufacturers, but I've got Claire going like that, and we've got some manufacturers' boilers. So for instance, Ideal and 𝗵𝗲𝗁𝗍 are two manufacturers' boilers out there where you can't adjust the pump speed. They're either nearly maximum or they're maximum. Okay, so a lot of guys I speak to say DT20 balancing across rad circuits is impossible. Okay, it's not impossible. It's just the fact it's bloody difficult. And the reason it's bloody difficult is because you've got maximum pump pressure and it's just literally absolutely zooming that water around those circuits. And if you've got like an ideal logic on an 8 rad house, unless you've got the auto balancing TRVs fitted, you're going to really, really struggle to get that system balanced up. No matter how hard you try or how long you spend on it, it won't matter about the index circuit because the water will be going that fast and with that much pressure through the circuit, it won't matter. You will not be able to balance that circuit up. It'll be impossible. And this is what myself, Kim, Rob Berridge, quite a few others are trying to say. Look, we don't need these. We need fully modulating pumps. We don't want boilers that can't modulate the pump output in any way, shape, or form. They've got to modulate because if you're putting those boilers and those boiler pumps aren't going onto a one system fits all system. They're going onto a system which you then should be able to adjust that pump speed to suit the system. If you can't adjust the pump speed, you've got very little hope of actually balancing that circuit. And with balancing and setting up the pump pressure correctly and everything else comes efficiency out of the boiler. So the one thing that most people are losing with the Ideals and the 𝗵𝗲𝗁𝗍s, unfortunately, as popular as they are, is actually system efficiency. Because if they are, God forbid, running at 80 degrees, you're never going to get them in condensing mode. It's going to be whizzing around there and you're going to have like really narrow DTs across the radiators. And you physically, they're just out of condensing mode all the time. And by the ability to actually slow that pump pressure down and have the water at the correct flow rate around the circuit, we're actually achieving then, we're actually getting the 𝗪𝗪𝗔s across the radiators we're trying to achieve. Balancing is that much easier just because you can get those pumps at the correct pressures. balancing becomes really easy, and actually your job becomes really easy. So, but without that, it's really difficult. But so, you know, like I said, most of the other boiler brands out there, you know, and there's lots. I'm not even going to name them because I think it's pretty much every other boiler brand out there will have some sort of modulating pump and some sort of modulation available. But for whatever reasons, those boilers don't have it. And like I said, unfortunately, 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗃 and Ideal installers just think DT, you know, balancing heating systems is just impossible, and it's not, and you can't achieve it. It's not, and like I said, it's not the fact you can't achieve it. It's just all these things are in your way and stopping you achieving, you know, your ability to achieve that end result. So, yeah. So, like I said, if you've ever done solar thermal before, that's really key understanding to actually setting up like an index circuit on and actually balancing radiators full stop. You always start with on a solar thermal system, you always start with the pump speed, and then you have a little balancing valve that you actually reduce there. If the flow rate's still too much, then you have a little balancing valve, and that basically in effect is your lock shield valve. So, and then you can get it at the correct amount of flow, which will then give you your correct DT and your correct heat output.
So going back to what you said about these boilers that don't have adjustable pumps.
Yeah.
Is there anything that the installers can do to apart from changing the boiler, obviously, because customers aren't going to want that, but is there anything to I don't know, an add-on or a widget or something that can be, I don't know,
funny you should mention that, speaking of Drayton as you are. So yeah, there's a couple of ways you can do that. Let's say you got 10 rads, okay? We'll have to throw budget into this, of course, because obviously budget is always very relevant. We've been trying to discuss or trying to explain the difference between balancing the system and just getting all the radiators hot. So we know it's all about divvying up the right amount of flow to the right radiator so everybody gets what they want. We can either do that using these pressure independent balancing valves that you sell, but that means one on each radiator, which will be 10, I don't know, 30-40 pounds each. Or something else you can do is you can put something called a STAD valve on the return. Now what a STAD valve will do, it won't individually divvy up the pressure into each of the 10 radiators, but what it will do, it won't allow any more flow out than the maximum requirement for that system. So that's a couple of ways. I've done some of those before Christmas, knowing that these you know, these horrendous bills were coming. A lot of my kids' friends have moved into new houses, so I've been playing around there, upgrading S plans into priority hot water and trying to get combis to, as Richard says, to try and get some DT across. I mean, what I think a lot of people don't understand about DT is if your DT is 20, which is what we're aiming for, and you've got a flow of say 60 and a return of 40. If we allow the DT to narrow, so we've got a return of 60 and a flow of 60 and a return of 50, our return temperature is moving further and further and further away from condensing mode. Now, if you go back to this theoretical 20 DT, which you can do, I mean, it's hard work, there's no question about that. It's hard work. But because all of our systems are over pumped, because there's probably 3 times the flow rate going through them, the DT narrows to about a third. So we've gone from sort of 20 to 7, somewhere around there, 7 or 8. And of course, if your flow temperature is 70, if you're on a traditional combi, your flow temperature is 70 even, your return temperature is still going to be higher than 60. So again, we've moved miles away from condensing, and that's just because we can't set the pump pressure. So it's just some of the simple things that you can do can make quite a tremendous difference. One of the, I mean, during the couple of days when I'm chatting to guys, you know, when we're trying to mull over all this sort of stuff, I wouldn't say that's a highlight, but one of those, oh bloody hell, I never realised, oh that makes sense, moments is when you talk about valve authorities. You say, well, you know, you've got 5 or 6 turns on your lock shield, and yet it all happens in the last half a turn. And you know what? Can anyone explain that? Nobody does. And you say, well, it's because there's 4 times the flow rate flowing through the pipe. So the second you touch that lock shield, about 100 gallons flows through the radiator. And especially on a smaller rad, you've got no chance of doing it. But if we can get the right amount of flow, so if we put a STAD valve on, and we cap the flow at the boiler. So we say, right, we're not going to let any more than the same. Richard was talking about 7 kilowatt system. So we're not going to let any more than 7 kilowatts out of that boiler, no matter what the boiler wants to do. So we've now got a maximum of 7 kilowatts of flow. Suddenly, we now haven't got all that extra flow in the system, and suddenly our lock shields aren't going to only be responding in the last quarter of a turn. I'm not saying you're going to get 4 turns out of them, because you won't, but you'll certainly be able to control it. Then you're in with a fighting chance of getting somewhere around your 20 DT across your rads.
Yeah.
But trying to do it with unrestricted flow is like Rich says, I think everybody tries it once. Everybody's heard what you're supposed to do. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you think, yeah, system's up and running. I'll just get my clamps out and I'll just try and balance it. And you think, bloody hell, I've got to get home sometime tonight, and I'm still on the first one. Faffing and fanning around, because it's almost impossible if the pump speed's too high. So
yeah.
Quick answer to your question there is, yeah, there are a couple of them. There might be some I haven't thought of, but obviously to be able to adjust the pump would be the first one. If you can't adjust the pump, best one would be put pressure independent valves on them all. And then if you can't do that, put like a stab, even a gate valve, to be honest. I mean, all you're doing really is adding resistance into the circuit. So I mean, at the end of the day, you could do it with a gate valve, but then of course you need some clamps on it to try and get that. You'd have to adjust it with clamps.
You don't know your flow either, though, do you?
No.
If you use a gate valve or a ball valve for resistance, then you still don't know actually what flow's going down your circuit. Where the stat is actually a fixed thing. So it's actually lots of people asking for links for stat valves. I'll get Claire to post it up later, but like 𝗵𝗲 said, the horrific thing, which you got to keep working at this, because we do, bless 𝗵𝗲, he keeps bashing 𝗿𝗿𝗚 and backs in a few others, and God knows how he hasn't ended up in court yet. But I mean, it's dead true. I mean, the problem is that I don't know how, because if you think about a truly indexed pump, okay, so if you think about a boiler, okay, that actually modulates its output from 10 kilowatts of heat output down to 3.2 kilowatts, okay, it doesn't need the same amount of flow for both points. Okay, for 10 kilowatts obviously we need more flow. For 3.2 kilowatts we don't need anywhere near, we need what, we need 2/3 less flow, don't we, for 3.2 kilowatts. So the issue is, if you maintain at DT10 output, when you actually, the heat output is down at 3.2 kilowatts, we don't need anywhere near that flow. And actually we're sending way too much flow around the circuit for actually the heat output. So we don't actually need it, because ultimately what you're trying to do with a pump is actually get the heat away from the heat exchanger of the boiler or the heat pump or whatever you're trying to do. That's the ultimate aim of it, okay? Because what you may not know, but most boilers, if you set it to like 50-degree flow temperature, it will only go up to 5 degrees above that before it will actually trip the burner out. So what you've got to do is maintain that flow away from that heat exchanger to actually keep the burner on. Okay, so for 10 kilowatts of flow, we need more pump pressure than we actually do for 3.2 kilowatts of flow. So what you actually have out there is a lot of boilers that actually index link the pump speed to the actual output of the appliance. So what you do is you set your pump to give you 10 kilowatts of flow, or 10 kilowatts of pump pressure at 10 kilowatts, but you then set the pump down to a lower speed when the burner actually modulates. And what you have is this sliding scale of pump speed. And what that helps is that it actually helps you keep your DT across your circuit. So because what happens is, if we help me out here, Kim. So if we balance for 10 kilowatts across the circuit, actually, if we don't need 10 kilowatts, we only need 3 kilowatts. We need that flow rate to be a lot less. Otherwise, you'll end up trying to put 10 kilowatts of flow into the circuit. All right. Yeah. So ultimately, so what we're trying to say about the STAD valves is that the STAD valves always limit to your maximum output. But as your air temperature changes outside and actually comes up a bit, so actually goes to like, instead of -4, it comes up to like +7. We don't need that 10 kilowatts anymore. We don't need that maximum output. You need a lot less. So actually, what we do with the ideals and things like that, it's because you can't adjust that pump speed. They try and, if it's say it's a 30 kilowatt heat input boiler, they'll try and chuck 30 kilowatts into the space heating circuit, because that boiler's allowing that much flow around it. So you're struggling to adjust it, and you just give up in the end. You think, oh, you know what, I'll just leave them all open circuit. By leaving them all open circuit, you're actually allowing a gateway for that amount of slug of energy to actually go into that circuit. And your customer turns around to you and goes, you know what, they heat up in no time at all. They're lovely and hot. 5 minutes to have it on, and they're already stonking hot. And that's the complete opposite to what you want. You don't want that 30 kilowatt of slug into the heating circuit. You want the correct amount of energy into the circuit. So ultimately, boilers work on their return temperature. They work out off their return temperature where they actually need to be. So if your heat emitters are sized for, say, 10 kilowatts, and your house only actually needs 5 kilowatts, those heat emitters won't be able to get 5 kilowatts into those rooms without overheating them. And that's where the TRVs come in. Because if you're trying to put 10 kilowatts in, but it only needs 5, those TRVs start trimming the actual flow rate into those radiators. So you can only achieve 5 kilowatts of heat input. Because if you try and put more than that, it overheats the rooms. The TRVs shut down, restrict the flow. They don't actually turn off the flow rate. They actually, they're liquid expansion, and they actually reduce the flow rate through. So you end up then with 5 kilowatts of flow in the circuit, okay? So kind of what happens is if you've got an unbalanced system with TRVs and a pump you can't adjust, you end up with a slug of energy go in, the room temperatures rise really quickly, the TRVs have to put the brakes on, and then you get this horrible scenario where the boiler then tries to modulate down, can't modulate down quick enough, and it will then start short cycling and all the horrible things that come with it. Where actually, if you have the pumps, it all kind of starts with flow rate and pump speed. If you get all that right, you get a boiler that actually runs really, really crisp and nice and really efficient. And yeah, where am I going with this?
I'll come in there, Rich. So the one thing that is automatic with a pump, we know that for any given kilowatt output, so any number of kilowatts that are coming out the boiler, we need a particular amount of flow to carry that heat away. If there's not enough flow, then obviously the boiler's going to heat up and it's going to modulate or it's going to cycle. So when the boiler, so the thing that determines the amount of kilowatts coming out the boiler at the end of the day is the fan. I mean, put it in rough terms, the more the fan blows the gas into the chamber, the more kilowatts the chamber is going to produce. So as the fan speed increases and decreases, to increase and decrease the amount of kilowatts that's coming out the boiler, we need the pump to increase and decrease at the same time. So as the boiler's making more kilowatts, so we want the pump to pump those extra kilowatts out into the system. So here we are. Let's see how we do this. So we're back to front, aren't we? Let's do it that way. Okay. So there we are. So there's my fan speed going up and down. Cool. Yeah, it's like being back to front, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So there's my fan speed going up and down. So there's me, I don't know, 30 kilowatts up there. And here's me perhaps right down to 5 kilowatts there. Now, the problem we've got is that the manufacturers, oh, hang on, my hand's not in. Got to get over there. Nope, got to go that way.
Other way.
Good grief. Okay, so the problem is the manufacturer sets the pump speed at maximum there. So as the fan goes up and down, okay, so the maximum pump pressure goes up and down with it. The problem is that this here is perhaps 3 times the pressure than the index circuit. So it's pumping, let's say, 3 times the flow rate. What we need to do is we need to adjust this to the index circuit. Hang on, get there. There we go. Oh, wrong way. There we go. And so now we've set the pump, and they now go up and down with the correct amount of flow rate for the index circuit, catered for the index circuit. So if we just leave it up, there where it comes out the box, which is what we do, either on 70, 80 or 100% normally, and the manufacturers leave it at 100% because they know everything's going to get hot and they're not going to get any phone calls. And they're right, because it does get really hot really quick. Everybody thinks they've got a really good system, and actually they've got a pretty naff system. Because like Richard was saying, you know, you've got a 10 kilo or 7 kilowatt system, and every time the boiler starts up, if we don't tell the boiler it's not a 7 kilowatt boiler, if we let it think it's a 30 kilowatt boiler, every time that boiler starts up, it's going to go, yeehaw, 30 kilowatts, here I come. And it is, the pump's going to rev up to maximum, the boiler's going to go up, and it's going to put this massive slug of hot water in. And then all the associated things that come with that afterwards. So that's how I try and explain it. We have to tie the pump pressure in at the right place. So when the fan revs up and down, giving more or less kilowatts, the pump's pumping out more or less kilowatts, but only just enough pressure to overcome the index circuit, so we're not wasting any. That's really weird doing that back to front.
Yeah, you did a good job of that, mate.
Yeah,
you did a good job of that. Yeah. The other thing to mention is that obviously as we went from cast iron boilers, yeah, so we had cast iron boilers which had very little resistance through them, okay, to boilers these days which have got quite a lot of resistance through them at upper flow rates. Because this is the thing that you need to bear in mind, that obviously we've got boilers with pumps that are 7 meter head, okay. And the reason they're 7 meters head is because the manufacturer's gone, well, you know, if we got 1,000 liters per hour through this boiler, we need 6 or 7 kilowatts to actually we need 6 or 7 meters head of pump pressure to actually get the actual flow through the heat exchanger. But the problem with that is by the manufacturers, because what we've done, we've oversized everything. Okay, so with the manufacturers then going, well, we need, Christ, if we actually get that amount of flow, we're going to need this size pump. Right, and the problem is that with these size pumps become bigger, they have pump impellers on the back of them. Right, so I'm struggling with my way around now. Look. So they have a pump impeller on the back of it, and to achieve 7 meters head, you've got to have a bigger impeller. Okay, but the problem is that when you want to slow that pump down, so say you only need 200 liters an hour, okay, or less than that, maybe 150 liters an hour of volume of flow through the heating circuit. That pump won't do it. That pump will go, well, because I'm so big and I'm 6 or 7 meters head, right, I can't actually slow down that much. The slowest I can go is 300 liters an hour or 350 liters an hour. And then the problem is where your burner will modulate down to the right place to actually get that correct amount of heat at the right place, right time, your pump won't go down low enough. And the problem we have is a lot of manufacturers' pumps out there actually on the bulk of the systems are way over spec for actually what the pumps we require. So we probably need in the majority of systems out there, maybe a 4 meter head pump. You don't need any more than that, yeah, and then having a smaller pump would actually give us much more authority over the system, because as it's slow, if we had a system that could, so a boiler that could slow the pump speed right down, if we had a 4 meter head pump and that could modulate its output, say, I'm just guessing, but say it was 1,000 liters an hour on maximum and it was, 50 liters an hour on minimum, that type of pump would be really beneficial to having a system that then run really efficiently. Because like Kim said, when they tie themselves in like that, and they actually tie themselves into the right amount of flow at the right time to the right circuit, and that would really aid balancing really, really well. But we're not in that scenario, unfortunately. We have these combi boilers or even system boilers with massive pumps that we probably never require on the majority of systems, and we just really struggle there.
Yeah, but if we go one stage further on massive oversized pumps, it's when you see 3 or 4 pump stations in a 4-bedroom house. Yeah. And one of the pump stations is just pumping a towel rail. Yeah. Well, to be polite, you can pee more than a towel rail needs. And here we are putting a 35 kilowatt system pump on it, which, as we know, can't modulate down, and usually they're not set anyway. So I mean, we've gone pump. I mean, we know that everything's oversized. This epidemic of oversizing, it's like a frenzy. And the manufacturers are quite happy to carry on with that frenzy. Obviously, they're making good money out of it. I do wonder if they're, I mean, I don't know personally any pump manufacturers, but I do wonder if there is a physical problem with making a very, very small pump. The smallest ones I've seen are the little pumps in the ATAG pump cabinet, which are like really, really, really small. But I can't remember what they are now. I should know. But they've got very low minimum flow rates. Unfortunately, you can't buy those. You can't buy those separately. They're OEM ones. But if you look at USP3s, if you look at all the green knob technology from 𝗺𝗺 and the new ones, the 𝗵𝗲 and the 𝗵𝗀𝗺, minimum outputs are all way too big. When you look at all of our new houses, 20-30 years old, they've all got probably 8 kilowatts or less heat load. What's that, 300 liters an hour, something in that region? That's when it's -4. Most of the day it's going to need less than that. Some of these pumps, the minimum it can do, as you're rightly saying, is that or more than that. And so you just go round and round in circles. Even when you know what the problem is, sometimes it's difficult to get a solution to it. Yeah. And nobody cares. I mean, one of the least supported parts, I think, of any boiler when you phone up is pumps, because I don't think the vast majority of people that I've spoken to at manufacturers, and I've phoned up and I tried to get a bit more information on pumps. I mean, I've got to say, Ideal don't even put a pump map in, and I phoned the guy up and said, how am I supposed to adjust this? There's no pump map. Can I, can you download? Where do I go? Can you send me a link or something for a pump map? But they don't appear that you can't get a pump map for an Ideal. And he assured me that their pumps were fully automatic and you didn't need to do anything. And I've had that conversation with quite a few people, and you say, no, mate, they're not automatic. You got to get in there and set them. I mean, even auto detect. I'm interested to know how an auto detect. I mean, I am generally interested to know how an auto detect pump looks down. When I say, what does the pump see when it's looking down the pipe? Yeah, looking down the pipe of the system. What does it actually see as its circuit? What's it got to do today? And how does it know whether microbore is high resistance because a TRV or a zone valve shutting, or it's microbore because you need, like on a system pump, we have constant pressure and variable pressure to get around that problem. But how does an auto detect pump know that? And you phone up. I've phoned up quite a few people about that, Valiant mainly, to be fair, because they're big into them, and say, can you explain how this works? I don't seem to be getting enough pump pressure. I want to get a bit more pump pressure out. I can look at the map. I can see there's more pressure available. I'm looking at the pump map now, which is always a bit of a challenge for the guy on the other end of the phone, because normally they don't know what a pump map is. Never mind, the information you can take from it. How do I get more pump pressure? Where do I need to go in it? And again, I'm not a Valiant expert. I always struggle with the menus. I think I'm close. I'm there. I'm in the right area. How do I get more pump pressure out? I can see there is some, and they say, oh no, it only goes to 70%. And you think, in this particular case, I need a bit more pump pressure, and they've capped it at 70%. Now that's obviously not all the boilers. Can't remember which one it was. It was one of the Valiants I was playing with a while ago. So it's difficult to get a lot of information from pumps. If you phone up 𝗺𝗲, if you look in your boiler and think, well, okay, it's got a 𝗺𝗲 in it, and you phone up 𝗺𝗲 and say, hey, I've got a such and such a boiler, it's got one of your pumps in. Oh, that's OEM, nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that. You'd have to speak to the manufacturer. And so you just go round and round in circles with it. It's quite frustrating.
Well, some of the worst things, isn't it, is that when you're actually trying to work all this out, so there's some key things you actually need to actually work it all out. And one is a resistance graph across the heat exchanger. Okay. Yeah. So for the heat exchanger of the boiler that you've got, you actually need to know what resistance. So it's a linear resistance. So the more flow you have, the more resistance you have across your heat exchanger. Yeah. So the problem is that some boiler manufacturers don't even have that information in their manufacturer instructions. No. So our mates at Ideal, they don't even put that information in their manufacturer's instructions. So you're on a loser to start with, because you need to know that information to actually set your pump speed right, because you've got two types of resistance. So one is the heat exchanger resistance, and then one is your heating system resistance. So your resistance across your heating circuit. So those two things equal your total system resistance. So without knowing that, how do you ever set it right? And I've questioned that. I mean, they did it in the Worcester boiler brochures, in the manufacturing instructions as well. No heat exchanger resistance charts, which I find, if there's ever dumbing down of installers, that's a classic number one of it, is just basically no information whatsoever. They don't even give you the opportunity to use your intelligence to work it out. So, and we've got that scenario in place. So there's these key things in there that you need to know. Obviously, as you reduce the good news is, in any scenarios, as you reduce your flow rate, which we don't need these big flow rates. There's a question up there, I think it was from Ian, I think it is.
Ian,
is it Claire?
Yeah, this one.
So he said, if I range rate the boiler, for example, to 7 kilowatts, do you still need to adjust the flow rate? Well, the answer is yes, because why would you want more flow rate than the actual output of the appliance is given anyway? So if your output is 7 kilowatts, you only need a given flow rate for that amount of output actually into that space heating circuit. If you've got too much flow, then what you're still going to have your 7 kilowatts going into that space heating circuit, but you've got a very good opportunity that you're going to narrow the DTs of that heating circuit, or it's going to be much more difficult to balance. So you still need to adjust that flow rate if you range rate it, because range rating doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to have the right amount of flow rate. So it's a linear thing. If you think about a heat exchanger that's giving you 7 kilowatts of heat, you need 7 kilowatts of flow to get the 7 kilowatts of heat off that heat exchanger. If you have too much flow, you might actually not get that. You're not actually then allowing that heat exchanger to get to the correct temperature if you've got too much flow. If you imagine a hose pipe off the boiler, if we didn't have that going around the heating circuit and we just had it go into a drain, and we increase the actual, if you think about how a combi boiler works, if we actually increase your water out of your tap quite significantly, actually past the manufacturer's specs. So say the manufacturer says that at 10 litres a minute, you'll get 45 degrees of increase in temperature on your delta T. What if you actually increase the flow rate past that 10 litres a minute up to 15, you'll never achieve that 45 degrees, will you? You just can't get that 45 degrees because you can't put enough energy into the water that you're flowing. So there's a couple of things with that. So obviously one's you'll narrow your DT across your circuit, but what the other thing is that if there's too much flow and not enough kilowatts, then it just takes that proportion longer to actually get up to temp. So right amount of flow rate for the right amount of given energy will give you the correct, so when you're trying to get your delta T's, it'll all just kind of zone in better. But you can still flow. You can flow. I mean, there's a bit of a misconception about the delta T20. The reason we have delta T20, so this is something important to bear in mind, is that when we first had condensing boilers come out, we needed to get them into condensing mode. Okay, so where our old boilers were run at DT11, because they weren't condensing. We didn't want them to condense, in fact. We didn't want the heat exchangers to have acidic condensate actually collect around them. So we wanted them to run at 81 degrees and come back at 70, because we didn't want them condensing. We wanted that energy exchange at higher temperatures. We didn't want the boilers condensing. Where when condensing technology came out, they were like, well, we need these things to run at 54 degrees on or below to get them condensing. Well, we got 70 degree systems. How are we going to do that? Well, I'll tell you what, let's do delta T20 instead of delta T11, and then at least we're bringing them back at 50. So, that fraction of the whole heat exchanger, that much is condensing. This lot up here is not condensing, but, hey-oh, it's the best we can do. So that's why we have the DT20 thing. So we don't actually need DT20. If we had a 55 degree flow temperature, for instance, we could probably get away with a DT11 and you'd still get pretty decent efficiencies out of that, because you've got now a massive proportion of that heat exchanger in condensing mode. So actually we could increase the flow rate and actually have a narrower DT if you wanted at that aspect. But, if you've got high temperature boiler, 70 degree flow, 50 return, that's traditionally how, when condensing boilers came in, that we actually started redesigning our systems. That was the sort of specifications we gave it, and DT was critical, and the DT20 was critical. But it's less critical the lower the flow temperature we go. So like I said, if you get a boiler running at 45 degrees flow temperature, you're not going to achieve DT20. You're not going to get 45, 25. That's going to be virtually impossible, because your heat emitters, they just won't exchange that amount of heat. And you'll struggle to get that. The probably best you'll do in that scenario with a radiator system is probably 45, 35 or something like that. Is probably the absolute best you'll
I'll
get.
just go on that one. Just before I want to pick up on that note, just the range rating thing. Some of the companies say you don't need to range rate their boilers. You can guess who they are. If you don't range rate your boiler, the boiler is being reactive, not being proactive. If you can tell your boiler in the first place, right, mate, as from today, you're a 7 kilowatt boiler, it doesn't know that it's got an extra 20 kilowatts sat inside the case, because it's only allowed to use the 7. If we rely on the sensors, the NTCs, to automatically range rate it, which is what they say, we don't need to do that, it range rates automatically. What we do is we put that slug of 30 kilowatts in, and we have to wait for the return temperature to come back and start to narrow the DT before the boiler starts to modulate down to the 7 kilowatts that we might be needing. So there is a real reason why range rating boilers are better than non-range rating boilers. They're proactive rather than reactive. Just picking up on something else you mentioned. I know it's one of the questions actually. Someone said, who's this? Michael Nelson. I find it hard to explain to customers who want instant heat. I get that. And one of the things I always say, to the guys that come in, as and when you do try and do this correctly, it's always a bit of a step into the unknown. You've always got your buttocks well clenched when you fire it up. You're not quite sure what's going to happen. And that run that you have, you know, you run to the first radiator to try and get there to see if it's getting hot when you're trying to, you know, just get all the rads hot. You run around all the rads, don't you? Right, which one's getting hot? Oh, that one is, or that one's not. Right, so turn that one down. That doesn't happen anymore. You know, everything's nice and slow and gentle, because we've only got now about a third of the flow and maybe a third of the kilowatts coming out. And so everything's nice and slow. And when you then go, if the first one you try is also a low temperature one, whoa, that's a bit of a bum tweaker, because nothing seems to get hot. And people do say, you know, oh no, my customer's not going to be happy with that. Well, actually, they're going to have to be. If they want to save energy, they're going to have to be happy with that, because, you know, our house is, we're at 21 degrees or 21.5, I think, in the front. We're at 21.5 all day. And we don't have a setback in my house, because my house is a bit old and drafty. But best I've tried to do it, I can't leave it on a setback. But if you've got a reasonably well insulated house, everything can be nice and low and gentle. You can have a nice setback temperature, and I appreciate that's difficult to sell as well. You know, Dad says, "Oh, I don't want my boiler on all night." Well, of course, it's not on all night, is it? It just stops the temperature dropping too low, so it doesn't go maybe below 18 degrees. So that when 6 o'clock comes and it all starts all over again, we're only going from sort of 18 to 21 rather than from perhaps 14 or 15 to 21. We've all got real-time energy with smart meters and apps and stuff. You can see how much energy you're saving or not saving. Now, you're not going to save £5 a day by leaving it on, but you know, certainly if you've got the right type of house, it's reasonably well insulated, you know, you can save gas by leaving it on. So everything is really slow and gentle, and that's what we want. We want long, low, sexy, slow heat. Yeah,
it's all about the comfort, isn't it? You know, for the customer.
It's all about comfort. Yeah, I mean, that's the prime object of it. Comfort first, then economy.
To Michael's question about how does he explain this to the customers, you know, as long as it's almost like, as long as you're warm and you're not, it doesn't really matter what your radiators are doing or what your boilers, to the customer, you know, if your boiler is working and you can feel that you're not cold, then basically you're okay. You don't need a red hot radiator. But I think that is definitely an education thing. Like, we've talked about this quite a lot, haven't we? And
it helps with controls as well. I know this isn't a control night, but you know, adjusting the pump speed, getting your flow rate correct into the correct rooms, into the correct radiators, it helps with controls, okay? Because controls are, like, especially older controls, they're reactive controls. They're not predictive, they're reactive. So if they see if you have a very dramatic energy, so say with a system that heats up very quickly and your room thermostat trips out, okay, you get a natural overshoot on the room temperature, which is really uncomfortable, actually. It's, you know, if you've ever been in a room where you've had like a 2 or 3 degree swing, so actually where it was meant to stop at 19 degrees because that's where you set it, and it actually goes up to 22.5 degrees and then peaks and comes back down to, like, you know, say it comes back down to like 18 before it cuts back in. Having like a 3, or, you know, I've seen bigger swings than that in some of the research we've done. It's like, that's a really uncomfortable swing to have in a room. It feels really uncomfortable. And actually having the correct amount of heat go in there at the correct amount of time, actually, if you've designed it correctly, so if you've got the correct amount of flow going to the radiator that you've actually calculated, that say it's a kilowatt, like Kimbo said, in the room, that room needs a kilowatt at -4 outside. If you've got the correct amount of flow going to that radiator at the correct amount of time, you've set all that pump up and everything else, that room stat actually isn't going to cut in at all. If you've got that room designed for like 20 degrees at -4 and you've got it set to 20 degrees, that room stat isn't going to kick in at all. You've got the correct amount of energy going in there, correct amount of time. It's going to feel nice in there all the time because you've got that correct amount of heat going in. The only time the thermostat's going to kick in and out is at the periods of time when it's not -4, when it's like +5 or +10 degrees Celsius, where you still need heat in that room. But now you need that internal room sensor to actually be tripping in and out. It needs to be controlling that board. It needs to be controlling the heat input into that room, because if it doesn't, then it's going to overshoot dramatically. So, but having the correct amount of kilowatts in the first place going into that system is going to help with that massively more than if you've just got an unrestricted amount of slug of energy going into that system. And that's, like I said, it all comes from there. It's like I said, we've guessed, and I've guilty of it, Kim's guilty of it, all in the past, obviously. But we guess these things. Or with the combis made it worse for us, to be honest. They made it, you know, if you think about, actually, it's a good point. The old combis, so the early condensing boiler combis, when they came out, they were fixed speed pump on speed 3. Yeah. So they were at maximum all the time because you needed that maximum pump pressure to get it around the plated heat exchanger in hot water mode. And then the problem was then is that it just stayed in there. So when it went over to the space heating circuit, I can remember several early condensing boiler installs I did. No hope of getting DT20. Absolutely no hope whatsoever. Because the reasons being, I didn't design the system properly. It was just replacement boiler for replacement boiler. But what you didn't realize is the boiler you replaced was like a cast iron boiler with a, and it was on speed 1 probably, that pump. Yeah, and you've now put, and it actually probably did have DT11 across the circuit, yeah, unbeknown to you at the time, but you ripped it out, put this combi on the wall that had 6-speed pumps, and then you really messed things up because there's no way you're ever going to achieve DT20 now. You're not even going to achieve the DT11 that you had before because the system, it's just impossible. It makes it impossible, and that's the key thing. Where the boilers these days, like the really good boilers out there, like the combis and the system boilers that do the 2 flow temperatures, when you get those systems, what they do is they have a fast pump speed when they recover the cylinders, or they're doing domestic hot water mode for the combi. But then those pumps slow down when they go back to space heating mode. And that's the key thing, is having a pump that will adjust its output based on your set points for heating. And if it's doing hot water, that's the point at which you want to divert it to priority hot water, and then have that go around the hot water system, recover, and then come back to a slower pump speed for your space heating circuit again, you know. And that's sort of the perfect scenario, really. But it just highlights, you know, I think you'll all relate to that, is that, you know, anyone that did the early condensing boilers with a fixed speed pumps before ERP pumps came into equation, they were really difficult to balance. And you know, shocking really. If we probably researched a few of those boilers now, we'd probably find they're really crap. You know, the efficiencies would have been, no, you know, they were all what, 91% ERP rated. They were probably running 70 at best. Probably worth, you know what I mean? Probably in the same sort of borderline efficiencies as the cast iron was running. So, you know, the only efficiency they got was on the startups and cool down period. So when your customer going, oh yeah, saving 100 quid a year since you fitted that boiler, it was only the period that they warmed up and cooled down. You know what I mean? The bit where they probably ran just as inefficiently as the cast iron boilers. But, you know, little did we know. Little did we know.
Throw one more in there. Like you said, we weren't talking about controls, but when everything's running nice and slow, okay, traditionally we sort of put the heating on half an hour before we get up, don't we? That means in old money with the timer, you put the timer on half an hour before you get up, and you wouldn't have any idea at what time the room actually got to temperature. And of course that depends on the outside temperature. Now, I'm not saying this just because we're on Drayton here tonight, but I've got Drayton 𝗺𝗲𝗺𝗀, and I've got something called auto start, which most of these things have got, and I can hear the actuator on the radiator. It's on my side of the bed. I can hear it clicking in the morning, and I can open one eye, look at my clock, and I've got a rough idea what the outside temperature is, because the earlier it starts, of course, the colder it is outside. And so that's another way of you know, we don't have to have we've taken all the guesswork out. We put all the right stuff in. If we get it all right, we've taken all the guesswork out of it. We can get some really good efficient systems. And again, you were talking about low temperature stuff and not getting a 20 DT. You know, if you've got 55-degree flow rate, you're dead right. You're not going to get 35 degree. It's very, very difficult to do that. So, you know, my thoughts on that, I said, well, let's give in to that. Let's keep the boiler on 20 DT if we can. You don't need to really. Sorry, let's not do that. I'm not going to head of Zoe. So let's get the boiler at 10 DT. So we've got 55-45. Now, what that means is our mean water temperature's gone up by 5 degrees. So our correction factor's changed. So we don't need such large radiators. There's actually a good part of doing that. And also, if we don't need such large radiators, probably more of the radiators that are in the house are big enough, if not for the room they're in, certainly to go into a bedroom upstairs or something else. So, you know, 20 DT isn't the be all and end all of everything. It's about designing the system to get it to run as efficiently as you can. And people say, oh, well, hang on a minute. If you set it to 10 DT, then the return temperature, well, it's going to be 10 degrees higher. Well, it's probably going to be 10 degrees higher anyway, because as you just explained, the boiler isn't going to be able to give us 20 DT, even though we're asking for it when we start to modulate down. There was something else I was going to say.
Yeah, just picking up on your flow rate thing quickly there. So with so actually there is a benefit, because obviously, like I said, these pumps are massively oversized. So if you're say you calculate it out at DT20, so you're trying to achieve a 55 35 DT20, you're going to really struggle in a small house to actually achieve that very small flow rate. So actually, by narrowing that DT a bit, so 55-45 instead of 55-35, actually we're going to actually bring that into more of the realms where the pump will operate probably more efficiently. Do you know what I mean? Because we've just increased that flow rate a bit, and like Kim said, you'll be able to reduce your rad sizes a bit. I appreciate there is this ultimate sort of sanction that's saying, we need to do this, we need to have DT20 on boilers, this, that, and the other. Actually, the efficiency gains once you get your return temperatures down in sort of the 40-degree mark. You're probably not going to ever get that money back on what you would have actually ripped that rad out and put a new rad in. You're probably not going to get that money back between the differences. So if you can use those existing radiators, like I said, have the pump actually run a bit higher pressure, so you get a bit more flow rate, and actually have your DTs a little bit narrower. So we're still within condensing mode, but we're not within the point that the boiler, if it did have a couple of radiators turn off, it's going to click in and off because of the variance in the flow temperature. So, but you do need a little bit of run room with DT and gas boilers. So we like I said, but having a slightly higher flow rate would be beneficial in some situations, but certainly not if you've got a high temperature strategy. You really want that DT20, because you need it in some sort of condensing mode. But I mean, if I was out there now, I mean, all my systems would be designed like I said, sort of 55-45 probably. That's a good place to put them in. And then it's more achievable that way. But
brilliant.
Yeah, I thought we might struggle to talk about pumps for an hour, especially with that Rob here.
Certainly not. We've
easy.
Excellent. It's always easy with you guys, isn't it? But I really hope that that's been useful to everybody who's been watching. Rob, Richard, Kim. Rob couldn't be with us tonight. He did send his apologies. So he's not with us, but he'll be with us for the next one. Thank you, Richard and Kim. I don't know if there's anything else to say other than keep tuned for the next ones. I think we've got one coming up in a couple of weeks. Also, you can catch up on last year's sessions. We've turned them into a podcast. So if any of you are into podcasts, check out the Heating Efficiency podcast. It's available on all the streaming sites. So have a listen to that if you want something to fill your ears up. And thank you ever so much for joining. And thanks, Richard. Thanks, Kimbo. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye, everyone.